This talk was first presented at the Lansing Lions Club, and I would like to thank my fellow Lions for sponsoring this presentation today. I will begin, as I always do, with my standard disclaimer. The opinions expressed in this presentation are my own, and they do not necessarily reflect the opinions of any employer, past or present, or of anyone else. Today's topic is whether the United States can prosper as a post-industrial society that relies on other nations to produce its manufactured goods and imports much more than it exports. Before I propose an answer to that question, I will present some information and perspectives on foreign trade that I think you will find interesting. Now, I know that you are all wondering what my answer will be. I hope it will not ruin the suspense if I tell you that this is the first in a series of talks on revitalizing American manufacturing and reducing reliance on foreign factories. You might have heard that a post-industrial economy is the next great stage in America's social evolution. You might have heard that reliance on foreign factories is inevitable. You might have heard that America's manufacturing jobs are lost forever. This series of talks will challenge those perspectives. I believe that we can revive manufacturing in America. The purpose of this talk is to show that we must. There is a lot of concern these days about unsustainable deficits. The most prominent deficit in most people's minds is the federal budget deficit. This chart shows the most problematic component of America's debt, the amount that is owed to governments and individuals outside the United States. This chart covers the period from 1978 to 2010. America's foreign debt was relatively low in the 1970s and 80s. In fact, in 1978, it was still close to zero. But America owed $7.9 trillion to foreign governments and individuals by 2010. Two-thirds of that amount is owed by the U.S. government. That $5.2 trillion worries me a lot. The remaining one-third is owed by U.S. corporations. That $2.6 trillion worries me even more, even though it tends to receive a lot less attention. Why does America have so much debt? Normally, an economy involves people earning money for producing goods and services, and then spending that same money to purchase those goods and services from one another. Why doesn't that seem to be enough anymore? Why do consumers and businesses and the government keep spending more than their incomes? A key reason is that America has had a negative balance of trade with the rest of the world since 1976. National income is defined as consumer spending plus business spending plus government spending plus net exports. When net exports are negative, then the sum of the other three categories has to be greater than national income. This is not just a theory or a general tendency. This is a definition. You cannot simply ignore a definition and hope for the best. Definitions do not go away just because you ignore them. As long as America imports a lot more than it exports, someone has to spend a lot more than their income. So it should not be surprising that the growth of America's trade deficit closely mirrors the growth of its debt. America generally exported a little bit more than it imported until the mid-1970s. Then the oil crisis brought what seemed at the time to be a very large trade deficit. The trade deficit skyrocketed after that, at the same time that there was a surge in foreign debt. The trade deficit decreased somewhat during the most recent recession, but it has rebounded since then as the nation has been moving toward economic recovery. In order to compare the trade deficit to America's national debt, it is necessary to re-express the trade deficit in cumulative terms. This is what that comparison looks like. The red line represents foreign debt. That's the same line that you saw earlier. And the blue line represents the cumulative trade deficit. The two lines are virtually identical. America's foreign debt of $7.9 trillion is almost exactly equal to its cumulative trade deficit of $8 trillion. The similarity of these two lines is more than coincidence. Coincidence helps too, because there are some technical factors that could have kept these two trend lines from being as close as they are. But the similarity follows directly from the definition of national income. which tells us that a perfect measure of the trade deficit would be exactly equal to a perfect measure of the extent to which America lives beyond its means. Even these imperfect measures are almost exactly equal for every year. Thus, the definition of national income tells us that the only way for a nation to import a lot more than it exports is to spend a lot more than its income. Looking at it another way, the only way for a nation to live within its income is to avoid importing a lot more than it exports. No matter what goes on elsewhere in the economy, the three spending categories will always have to exceed national income for as long as a trade deficit persists. If you want consumers and businesses and the government to start living within their means, then there needs to be a resolution of the trade deficit. Now it is time for some data on America's imbalance of trade. The U.S. has high levels of trade with most regions of the world. About 1/5 of America's imported goods were from Europe in 2010. 19% were from Asia, excluding China and Hong Kong. This slice of the pie primarily represents Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. 19% were from China, which includes Hong Kong. 19% were from Mexico and the rest of Latin America. 15% were from Canada, and 8% were from the Middle East and Africa. Over the past decade, shares have increased for China and the Middle East, and decreased for the remainder of Asia and for Canada. China and the OPEC nations, represented by those two slices of the pie that have been growing, happen to be the two regions for which America's trade imbalance has been greatest. In dollar terms, the U.S. imported more than twice as much from the OPEC nations as it exported in 2010. This accounted for 17% of the nation's trade deficit. In dollar terms, the U.S. imported nearly 3 times as much from China as it exported. This accounted for 48% of the nation's trade deficit. America's trade with the rest of the world was much closer to balance, with $47 in exports for every $53 in imports. These figures look pretty bad, but they are actually better than the figures for most other recent years. All 3 pairs of bars were even more unbalanced before the recession than they were in 2010. Trade deficits are larger for some types of item than for others. The U.S. actually exports more services than it imports. This consists largely of royalties, payments from foreign subsidiaries, and air travel. When people board American airliners in foreign countries, that counts as the export of a service. When foreign subsidiaries send funds to the U.S., that is also counted as exporting a service. Services are America's largest category of export. Now, you might say that royalties and payments received from foreign subsidiaries are not really exports from the U.S. In fact, if you say that, you will be right. These flows of funds are actually part of America's dependence on the rest of the world. Counting such things as exports does make sense for a system of national accounts, but it also makes exports deceptively high if your purpose is to understand how dependent the United States is on the rest of the world. That is not the question that America's national accounts are designed to address. The U.S. is also a net exporter of industrial supplies and materials, excluding petroleum. This includes raw materials and things like building supplies and steel. Wealthy nations used to import raw materials from developing nations and export manufactured goods, but that pattern has reversed in recent years. The U.S. also exports more food, feeds, and beverages than it imports. Although agriculture has accounted for a smaller and smaller proportion of the labor force each decade, that reflects increases in efficiency rather than decreases in agricultural production. Agricultural output in the U.S. has actually increased. People sometimes compare job losses in manufacturing to job losses that have taken place in agriculture, and conclude that America can survive and prosper as a post-industrial economy, just like it has prospered as a post-agricultural economy. That analogy might apply to the extent that jobs are being lost due to new technologies, but the analogy fails to the extent that industrial production is taking place elsewhere instead of in the U.S. What is happening to manufacturing is fundamentally different from what has happened to agriculture. Until 2010, the U.S. was also a net exporter of capital goods, but now it is importing slightly more than it exports for this category. This category includes machinery, equipment, and other goods typically purchased by businesses. There are 3 other major categories for which the U.S. imports more than it exports. Vehicles and parts, we import twice as much as we export in dollar terms. Other consumer goods, we import 3 times as much as we export in dollar terms. And energy products, we import about 4 times as much as we export in dollar terms. That is what the trade deficit consists of. I mentioned a few minutes ago that imports and exports of capital goods are close to balance. However, computers and computer equipment are an important type of capital good that concerns me. The red line on this chart represents imports of computer equipment, and the blue line represents exports. America used to export more computer equipment than it imported until about 1991. But this critical area has now become one of extreme dependence on imports. In 2010, America's imports of computer equipment were nearly 3 times as large as its exports in dollar terms. You may find it comforting to see that America's exports for this category are still pretty high. That makes it look like America must still be producing quite a lot of computer equipment. Enjoy that comforting thought now, while you can, because I will come back to this chart in a few minutes to explain why that is a false comfort. But before I move on to the rest of what I want to say, I want to take a few minutes to say what I am not saying. First, I am not saying that international trade is a bad thing. Free trade governed by market forces is generally a good thing. As an economist, I have a natural preference for letting markets sort things out instead of having governments or corporations try to override market forces. That does not mean that I am a free trade fundamentalist who would sacrifice every other priority for the sake of free trade, but I would prefer to see America fix its economy without restricting trade or provoking a trade war. I think that can be done. It is also important to note some important positive elements of the current trade situation. International trade is giving nations around the world a path out of poverty that was not available to them in previous decades. Moreover, it is efficient for each company to do what it can do best without artificial boundaries based on geographic location. Healthy competition is good for consumers, and it can be good in the long run for the competitors themselves. Finally, building economic ties with other nations is a good thing. It would be good to fix America's economy in a way that reduces the negative effects of the current trade situation without eliminating these positive effects. I think that can be done too. Secondly, I am not blaming China for America's trade deficit. Many of the Chinese goods that we buy are actually designed and marketed by American manufacturers that outsource their production to Chinese factories. The manufacturing process involves several other activities in addition to production, and American manufacturers are increasingly specializing in aspects of the process such as engineering, design, administration, and marketing. America's manufacturers seem to be keeping the brain work and outsourcing lower skill and lower value work to other countries. Enjoy that comforting thought now, while you can. I will explain in a few minutes why that is a false comfort. The point that I want to make now is that we cannot really blame China when American managers decide to close their own factories and outsource work to foreign factories. What China does is give us exceptionally good value for our money. If you go through your history books to make a list of complaints that countries have made about one another over the centuries, giving exceptionally good value for your money will probably rank pretty far down the list. So I do not blame China for America's trade deficit. Third, I am not suggesting sinister motives for Chinese economic policy. In fact, for purposes of this discussion, I am assuming that the leaders of China will not do anything that I would not consider doing myself in their position. So you can relate to the scenarios I will present in a few minutes as best-case scenarios. Each of them could be a lot worse if a hostile relationship were to develop between the U.S. and China, or if weakening the United States becomes an objective and not just a side effect of Chinese economic policy. This talk assumes that China will pursue its national interests without purposely seeking to diminish the health and welfare of the United States. At this point, I would like to offer a visual aid that symbolizes the trade relationship between American manufacturers and the overseas factories to which they outsource production. One of my sons has a wonderful little electronic gadget, and several months ago he purchased a screen protector, which is an invisible piece of plastic to keep its screen from getting scratched. This is what it looks like. It is about 2.5 inches by 4.5 inches, and it's invisible. That makes it a pretty good symbol for the role that many American companies play in international trade. The engineering and marketing for that invisible piece of plastic were performed by an American manufacturer, but the actual production took place in China. My son paid $15 for one of those invisible pieces of plastic, and I think it will be informative to consider how those $15 are reflected in America's national accounts. This product's contribution to imports might be charitably estimated as about $2, maybe $1 paid to the Chinese factory, and maybe another $1 or so to bring it across the ocean. I do not know the actual cost of producing and shipping invisible plastic, but I wouldn't expect it to be much more than that, even though this product does involve more engineering than meets the eye. The remaining $13 or so are part of U.S. gross domestic product. Some of those dollars can be attributed to the American manufacturer that did the engineering and marketing and made the decision to have the production take place in a Chinese factory. Some of those dollars can be attributed to the retailer, and some to the domestic shipper that brought the product to our door. Those $13 of U.S. GDP are totally dependent on the Chinese factory that does the production. And what happens if this fine product is exported to a third country? Let's say that it is sold to a British retailer for $10. That $10 sale more than offsets the $2 or so that is paid to foreign companies. The $8 that it adds to net exports is totally dependent upon the factory in China. So if you thought that America's trade statistics were worse than they should be, you should know that reality is worse than the statistics. A substantial portion of America's GDP, a substantial portion of its manufacturing, and even a portion of its exports actually involve designing and marketing and distributing the goods that are made for us in foreign factories. Seeing how this piece of computer equipment affects America's national accounts should be helpful for understanding statistics about imports and exports of computer equipment. In 2010, American businesses and consumers spent $185 billion on computer equipment. America's imports of computer equipment were valued at $117 billion. A simplistic comparison would therefore suggest that about 2/3 of our computer equipment came from foreign countries. But that $117 billion does not include the manufacturer's markup by the American firm that outsourced production or imported the product. It does not include the retail markup, and it does not include domestic transportation costs associated with those imports. In fact, it does not even include all of the computer equipment that America obtains from other countries. Some of the computer equipment that arrives in the U.S. is classified as an import of manufacturing services instead of as an import of computer equipment. The reasoning here is that outsourcing manufacturing services is analogous to outsourcing advertising services or janitorial services. Those advertising and janitorial and manufacturing services are all necessary for getting the product to consumers, but they are not equated with the product itself. Classifying some imports in that way means that this $117 billion figure understates the amount of computer equipment that the U.S. obtains from other countries. But even $117 billion in payments to foreign factories could easily represent more than enough imported goods to account for all the purchases of computer equipment by American businesses and consumers, after markups and domestic transportation costs are taken into account. In fact, it is enough to account for a large share of America's exports of computer equipment. When someone from Europe buys a computer or a piece of invisible plastic from an American company, they are often buying something that was produced for that company in a foreign factory. America's manufacturers export their engineering, their design, and their administration, but they're often exporting foreign goods. I cannot tell you exactly how dependent the United States is on foreign computer equipment. That analysis would require more knowledge and more resources than I have at my disposal. But I can tell you that all of the statistics I have shown you today understate America's dependence on imported goods, because markups and domestic transportation costs are counted as part of gross domestic product rather than being included in the import statistics. That is not intended as a criticism of the statistics. It is just that America's national accounts are not designed to produce a straightforward measure of the nation's dependence on imports. With that introduction, I am finally ready to address the question, is it a good idea for America to rely on foreign factories for a large share of its manufactured goods and to import a lot more than it exports? The answer is no, it is not a good idea. It involves serious military dangers, financial dangers, and economic dangers. I will speak briefly about two dangers from each category. First, relying heavily on factories overseas would be a very serious handicap during a major war. I make no prediction about when or why a major war might occur, or about which countries might be on each side. But history tells us that wars have occurred in the past, and that suggests that we should be prepared for wars to occur in the future. Since I am assuming, for purposes of this discussion, that China's leaders will not do anything that I would not consider doing, we can suppose that China will be on our side when a major war comes along. When a major war occurs, shipping is likely to be disrupted. It will be very difficult for a cargo ship to travel safely across thousands of miles of ocean. The picture that I am using to represent military dangers is not a destroyer or an aircraft carrier. It is a World War II cargo ship from a merchant marine recruiting poster. It commemorates the contribution that the merchant marine made to winning the war. In World War II, the branch of service with the highest casualty rate was not the Army, or the Navy, or the Marines, or the Coast Guard. The casualty rate for the merchant marine was more than twice as high as the casualty rate for the other branches of service taken together. Germany knew the importance of disrupting shipping, and that is what the war in the Atlantic was about. There have been dramatic improvements in missiles and drones and other offensive technology since World War II, so it seems to me that a major war is likely to cause very serious disruption to shipping. That means that a post-industrial society will no longer be able to count on output from overseas factories. And those are the factories that are relied upon for the computers and light bulbs and zippers and many of the other things we would need for both the war effort and the civilian economy. Moreover, when a major war occurs, many of the factories that make America's civilian goods will need to be converted to production of materials for the war effort. But what if too many of those factories are thousands of miles away? In World War II, America's factories enabled it to be the arsenal of democracy. I can imagine America being the field hospital of democracy, but I am not sure that we still have what it takes to be an arsenal of democracy. Every time production is shifted from an American factory to an overseas supplier, America's national security is reduced. So a post-industrial nation can be faced with the prospect of waging a major war without many factories of its own to produce military goods, and without even the computers and light bulbs and other imported goods that consumers and businesses rely on every day. If America finds itself facing that sort of disastrous situation in a major war, the first question many Americans might ask is, what will that do to my portfolio? That is an interesting question to consider. What do you think will happen to American companies that outsource production when they lose access to the factories that produce their products? It seems to me that no shipping means no products. No products means no revenue, no cash flow, and that eventually means no corporation. That would not be good for your portfolio. Retailers would also be adversely affected by no longer having as many products to sell. Imagine what the stores you shop at would look like without any imported goods. The remainder of the economy would be adversely affected by a collapse of goods-related sectors of the economy. the overall impact on your portfolio would probably be negative. War is not the only military threat. A country without enough factories to meet its basic needs is also vulnerable to economic sanctions. Economic sanctions could have many of the same results as war. There would be shortages of computers and light bulbs and Happy Meal toys. Without access to factories to produce their products, manufacturers that outsource production might go out of business. The service sector would be adversely affected by a collapse of goods-related sectors. Your 401k might become an 001k. Again, America's national security is reduced whenever production is shifted to overseas suppliers. In addition to those military dangers, sending huge amounts of money overseas raises some serious financial dangers. Our trading partners might someday start using the money we send them in ways that have adverse effects upon us. China currently uses much of the money that American corporations spend there to purchase U.S. Treasury securities. From America's standpoint, that is probably the most favorable thing they can do with that money. As long as our trading partners keep doing that, and also keep rolling over their existing securities as they mature, America will not experience many adverse effects from sending huge amounts of money overseas. It would be okay for America's trading partners to have trillions or even quadrillions of dollars of purchasing power stored away in Treasury securities, as long as they are satisfied with never using that purchasing power for anything. So far, that seems to be the case. But what if our trading partners start using some of their purchasing power in different ways? One thing they could do is purchase American companies or stock in American companies. That is already happening through China's sovereign wealth fund and similar funds from other nations. This added demand for stocks tends to raise share prices and make investors happy in the short run. When foreign entities purchase just a minority interest in American firms, then the main thing we lose is some of the profits from our labor. If we sell a controlling interest in our firms, on the other hand, we are also selling control of their patents, technologies, and business decisions. That would not be a good thing for America's economic future. Exchanging ownership of our corporations for consumer goods is not a prudent strategy, no matter how favorably priced the consumer goods happen to be. Consumer goods are discarded after a few minutes or a few years, but ownership of corporations would be lost indefinitely. Our trading partners could also purchase more American goods and services. If you are looking for an optimistic scenario today, this is it. This is the outcome I would like to see. But even this scenario has some negative aspects. For example, massive purchases of natural resources could be economically disruptive, especially if they take place suddenly or at a time when the U.S. is also trying to stockpile resources for emergency needs. Moreover, the number of dollars that exist overseas is so great that we could find ourselves selling more to other countries than we really want to. For example, China will face a huge retirement challenge before too long because of its one-child policy and aging workforce. Some of its trillions of dollars of stored purchasing power could then be used to purchase huge amounts of natural resources and goods and services from the U.S. There is nothing unreasonable about that. For a few decades, China has been working hard while America consumes the fruits of its labors. It would not be unreasonable to have a few decades where America works hard while China consumes the fruits of America's labors. However, even as we applaud the increase in jobs that would bring, and the improvement in our balance sheet, and the restoration of our factories, we should realize that it could be a rather unpleasant development if it happens too suddenly, or if it happens in conjunction with other economic disruptions. Americans have gotten spoiled by consuming a lot more than they produce, and will not enjoy working harder for other nations while consuming quite a bit less than before. Working harder is not the problem. The unemployment rate should be about 3% instead of 8 or 9%. That would be a good way for America to work harder. The labor force participation rate should probably still be about 67% instead of 64%. That would be another good way for America to work harder. And higher productivity would be a good thing as well. I have no objection to America working harder. Working for other nations is not the problem either. That is a reasonable result, and an inevitable result of America's years of consuming more than it produces. The problem is having our standard of living go down when our trading partners start spending the American debt that they have amassed. If we allow our foreign debt to keep multiplying, and if we fail to rebuild our manufacturing capacity, then that seems to be a likely outcome. That was the optimistic scenario. The economic dangers that a post-industrial economy can face go far beyond the financial questions of how much money America's trading partners have and how they might spend it. Consider for a moment the American companies that order invisible pieces of plastic and spatulas and other relatively non-specialized products from foreign factories, and then sell them under their brand name for many times what they paid for them. The financial rewards of these companies are out of proportion to the economic role that they play. These companies are very close to being totally unnecessary, yet those companies and their CEOs and their shareholders are pocketing far more money than the foreign companies that actually produce the goods. This is a situation that cries out for a brutal correction by market forces. Our trading partners could easily phase out their relationship with many American manufacturers. This could happen one product at a time over a period of years, or it could happen suddenly. Why sell spatulas or pieces of invisible plastic to an American manufacturer for $2 a piece if you can sell them directly to retailers or to consumers at a much higher price? That would be a smart and reasonable business decision. Consumers and retailers could come out ahead. Our trading partners would accumulate American money even faster than before. The only losers would be the American manufacturers that had outsourced their production to foreign factories. Their engineers and administrators and marketers would be out of luck and out of work. That is what can happen if you become economically irrelevant and rely on potential competitors to perform the most critical phase of your manufacturing process. Manufacturers of higher-end products are vulnerable too. For example, my son's invisible piece of plastic fits over the screen of a wonderful electronic device that is produced in China for an American firm with an excellent reputation and an outstanding level of consumer loyalty. By some measures, it is the most valuable company in the world today. When I buy a computer or some other product from that American company, I plug in a tracking number on a website and follow its progress as it leaves a Chinese factory town in the morning and leaves a shipping hub in the afternoon and then arrives in the US by the next day. What would happen if this company is regretfully informed one day that the factories it deals with have been ordered to terminate their contracts and to start producing comparable products designed by domestic firms? This American firm would face a very difficult situation. It would have a severe shortage of products, possibly no products at all, while it scrambled to find suitable manufacturing facilities elsewhere. In the meantime, it would face competition from new and probably outstanding products from its former suppliers that could be offered to consumers at a small fraction of the previous retail price. The loyalty of its customers would be sorely tested by the lack of available products from the American firm and the availability of cheap and outstanding alternatives from foreign firms. The company and its engineers and its marketers might soon find themselves out of business and out of jobs. Even designing the best products in the world is no guarantee of your company's economic future if you rely on your potential competitors to manufacture those products. My nightmare is that American consumers and retailers might someday be able to go to everythingrus.com and buy goods directly from foreign factories without going through American middlemen. These products would probably cost a fraction of what they cost now, whether they are sold to consumers one at a time or sold to retailers by the boatload. It is naive to think that foreign factories cannot operate without the contributions of American engineers and administrators and marketers. Losing our factories is taking decades. Once enough factories are gone, our engineering and administrative and marketing jobs can disappear much more quickly. They could even disappear overnight. Without factories of their own, American corporations would not even have the option of calling for protectionist trade policies. This would leave American consumers in an excellent position, aside from losing their jobs and losing their 401ks and losing their prospects for the future. Looking on the bright side, high-quality products would be available for a fraction of their previous prices. But would that situation last long? If manufacturers that outsource production can become irrelevant in a post-industrial economy, what about American consumers? China, for example, has no real need for more and more American money. Some analysts claim that China is dependent on the United States because that is where their money comes from. But China has already accumulated enough foreign exchange reserves to purchase its current level of imports from the United States for 29 years. And if China wants even more money, it can print its own. And the money China printed would be worth more than the money that they get from us. So why continue to so generously provide American consumers with manufactured goods? The day will eventually come when it is more advantageous economically or more advantageous geopolitically for Chinese factories to make goods to be consumed in China. That is likely to happen once the effects of its aging society start to be felt more strongly, if not before. Many of the same factors will apply to our other trading partners as well. Such developments would leave America with shortages of manufactured goods and without sufficient productive capacity or skilled workers of its own, struggling to rebuild its economy under a crushing load of international debt. That appears to be the logical fate of a nation that goes too far along on the path toward a post-industrial economy. I believe that there are good alternatives to the scenarios that I have described today. I believe that it is possible to revitalize manufacturing in America, and I will propose a strategy for doing so in my next talk. What should such a strategy look like? Most importantly, it should steer America away from the military, financial, and economic dangers that I have outlined today. It should also be good for workers and for employers, for consumers and for shareholders, for retirees and for taxpayers, for America and for America's trading partners. It is easy to think of solutions that might be good for some people at the expense of others, but the ideal solution would be good for just about everyone. The ideal solution would still involve high levels of trade with China and other nations. It would still involve America's trading partners growing in prosperity. It would not provoke a trade war. But it would also involve American factories becoming a viable alternative to outsourcing and producing goods economically enough that even our most efficient trading partners will want to purchase them. The ideal solution would be equally acceptable to Democrats and Republicans. I do not think that either party can set America's economy right while ignoring the concerns of the other. We need solutions that the entire nation can stand behind. The ideal solution would also be painless. Politicians do not like painful solutions. The public does not like painful solutions. In fact, I do not like painful solutions. Restoring manufacturing is a matter of life and death for America, but that does not mean that people are willing to actually make sacrifices to bring it about. I have tried to devise a solution that meets all four of these objectives. I hope that you come to the next talk in this series to find out whether or not I have succeeded.